Three writers, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and William Burroughs, met in New York in 1944 and became catalyst for a movement that became known as the Beat Generation. The current exhibit at the Whitney Museum of American Art, Beat Culture and the New America, 1950 to 1965, takes a look at the movement in all of its complexity. Here to talk about beat culture, its contribution to American life, and the legacy it has left are Allen Ginsberg, the poet who helped to shape the Beats, Stephen Watson, who has written a book, The Birth of the Beat Generation. He also served as a consultant to the exhibit, Nat Hentoff, a columnist at the Village Voice, and George Herms, the California artist, whose art exemplified the beat aesthetic. I am pleased to have all of them here for this exhibit and to talk about beat culture beyond the exhibit. Welcome. The exhibit says, this is the book of the exhibit from the Whitney, saying Beat Culture and the New America 1950 to 1965. Why 1950? Stephen, you were kind of a consultant to this. Your book is, in fact, says the birth of the beat generation, visionary rebels and hipsters, 1944 to 1960.
Right. And let me speak to the book immediately.
Okay.
Because 44 is the time when Allen and Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs first met one another and came together. And a lot of what we consider beat culture really happened in the late 40s in terms of the actual coming together, the relationships that were formed, many of the experiences that were later transformed into the beat literature. I think Lisa Phillips, who's really the curator of the Whitney exhibition, was interested in capturing this period of the Eisenhower years and looking how that led to the hippie years and to the later years in the 60s. So I think that's how it was her rationale for choosing those 15 years.
Was there, Alan, an event that marked the beginning of all this? I mean, we talk about the coming together of you and Jack and William.
Yeah, actually, I would think so. In terms of relation to the square or the regular culture, I think we were listening to Truman on the radio, and Joan Burroughs said he sounds like a haberdasher. and
what? So
you sort of sniffed. It sounded like some sort of a different kind of talk that was coming through on the radio than we were used to in personal life, sort of the more relaxed and funnier and more humorous and more open and more frank and more candid conversation.
Yeah.
Although Truman wasn't a bad guy by hindsight.
Compared to others.
Yeah. Nonetheless, he did blow up a bomb.
Yeah. If it began in 44 and began in this exhibit in 1950 to look at the Eisenhower years, when did it end? I mean, why the difference in terms of the exhibit, 1965, and your book, 1960?
Well, I'm trying to describe the birth, the rise of the group, and how when they first came to really major public attention. By 1960, that major public attention was fully there.
When did it come to your attention?
To my attention, and to a lot of other people I knew at the time, was when On the Road was published. And Gil Milstein of the New York Times wrote a daily review that was so enthusiastic, I mean so compelling. It was like a harbinger of spring after many deadly years, because this was a period when a very prominent academic, Daniel Bell at Harvard, had written a book called The End of Ideology. And Norman Podhoretz in commentary said, there's nothing more to be excited about. You know, everything that will happen now will be incremental. And here's this book, which I read as well as the review, that was decidedly non-academic. It was really a little like Charlie Parker breaking into the whole of jazz and turning it upside down. And that was very exciting. It was almost rejuvenating.
Before we go to some slides about the exhibit, all of you, tell me what it was about and what was its essence, what was its march, why was it different than what had come before?
For my money, thinking from 44 on to the present, a liberation movement, beginning with spiritual liberation, then liberation of the word, that is what was discovered through spiritual liberation in terms of vision or perception or alteration of consciousness or alteration of frame of reference. Then gay lib proceeds from that, and perhaps a catalyst then for other liberation movements. Certainly,
I would doubt that.
Well, the gay lib was, I think, quite an important breakthrough.
But before, go ahead.
Then also an interest in Eastern thought from the very beginning, from the 50s on, certainly, with the development of people like Gary Snyder and Philip Wayland, who is now the abbot of the Hartford Street Zen Center in San Francisco. So Buddhism, meditation, interest in the texture of consciousness as part of the spiritual liberation, therefore interest in marijuana, therefore realization of the hoax of the federal laws on marijuana and the trap of the junkies are put into when they should be sent to doctors instead of criminalized, like Jews in Nazi Germany with dogs after them. And then an interest maybe in pacifist politics, rising from a realization of meditation, and many outgrowths of that.
There was always a sort of literary sensibility at its core.
Oh, the whole thing was art as sacred. Okay. And sex as sacred, too. Sex and
sexual
art
liberation.
Right. Well, eros as sacred and sacramental.
It was self-liberation in every quintessential way, so far as I could see. But it was not. It was a social movement in some ways, as Alan pointed out.
Well, primarily literary, I would say.
But it was not essentially a political movement. Now,
not at all.
No.
Yeah.
But what is now being said about it, that's the mythology I meant, it is now said, as it was on a program on CBS Sunday morning, that after all, out of the beat, whatever, history, impetus, came the civil rights movement, came the anti-war movement. And I was thinking, sure, Abbie Hoffman, as you said before we went on, he went down south with a copy of On the Road in his pocket, but those black kids in Greenville, North Carolina, sitting at the lunch counters, getting their heads beat in. I will bet you they'd never heard of Kerouac. Yeah. They were impelled by something else. There was a degree of pacifist involvement in the anti-war movement, but it was mainly through people like Bayard Rustin and A.J. Musty.
And David Dillinger.
Dillinger is something else again.
David Dillinger and David McGregor.
But the point is the anti-war people, if there had been no beat movement, because of Vietnam, there would have been an anti-war movement.
Okay, valid point. But what is it shared? If it is not a direct link in terms of cultural and social with the literary sensibility at its core, what did it share with those movements that later became political and changed the face?
I think in
terms
of individuals, I expect it shared a lot. In terms of the collective movement, the impetus, the people running all these things, A. Philip Randolph, Martin Luther King, not much.
Not much kinship there.
No.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know.
Except, let me just say, as an artist, that there's a thing called freedom of expression, which I see as saloon doors that have to be kicked open. And there was a generation that came along and kicked those saloon doors open. The saloon doors go back shut. And they have to continually, every generation coming along. And I think the interest in the Beat generation now, we have a political climate not unlike the 50s. And so these advances that were made in civil rights, they're being closed down too. So there's something about the individual needing that freedom of expression that we all fought for in the kind of art we made.
So you're suggesting that sort of the conservative political philosophy that is in the majority today may very well spring a new kind of beat culture that will kick the saloon doors down?
I'd swear on it that it is going on.
But don't be surprised. Don't be surprised if Newt Gingrich suddenly tells us that he read On the Road and that had a great influence on him.
Sure it did. However, one thing, in terms of what you were saying, and Nat would know this really well, there was the problem of real censorship of books. In those days, you couldn't print the classic poet Catullus in English. And the so-called salacious passages had to be printed in Latin. The modern library edition of Satyricon of Petronius Arbiter had Latin passages where people were not supposed to read it in America. Henry Miller was forbidden. D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover was forbidden.
And Allen Ginsberg was censored on public radio.
Well, my book was censored in those days. And finally, there were a series of court trials ending in around 1962, which liberated Burroughs' Naked Lunch, and that opened the doors to the literary salon.
That's right.
But now they're shut again by the neoconservatives, especially Jesse Helms, because the same kind of censorship has been imposed on radio and television, but through the FCC, by a law put in by Jesse Helms forbidding so-called, undefined, indecent language.
These are the 7 words or something?
Yeah, the 7 dirty words.
24 hours a day.
Right.
So that my poetry, which is studied in college textbooks and high school textbooks is forbidden on the air during the hours when the kids are studying it.
And don't forget the school libraries and classrooms. Ralph Reed of the Christian Coalition said at his last convention, "I would rather have 1,000 school board members than a president of the United States." He knows where he wants to go.
He understands the politics of grassroots movement.
Basically, those guys are like Stalinists that want to control everybody's mind.
Sure. All right, before we go further and look at some of this, tell me more about the ethos, though, what it was like in the sense of the feeling at the time.
Well, as a middle-class kid, I was attracted, just like these school boards that he wants. I came out of this milieu attracted to poetry and art. And now, in hindsight, we're looking back, and the Beats are being called conservatives, Alan. Do you realize that? Because we believed in an older tradition of beauty, truth, art, all these ideas that were not part of the Eisenhower years and the rampant materialism that was being foisted on the public through advertising, something that we know a lot about today. It's still going on. And for all over America and around the world, actually, there was this magnetic attraction of people trying to find something other than what's the latest thing that you're supposed to buy according to what the advertisements tell you to buy.
But now, no fault of yours, the Beat ethos, the Beat artifacts are being used in television commercials. The culture devours everybody sooner or later.
I don't think that that's so bad. I think there may be a subliminal message that's coming through that could not be broadcast directly.
Not a bad idea. Listen,
what was its music?
Jazz. Music was jazz. Clearly,
Bob
and Charlie Parker at the center of it.
Billie Holiday, Charlie Parker.
But then again,
Monk.
but then again, those three people you just mentioned had no sense of what was going on in terms of Beat culture.
Oh yes, they did.
Well,
I Thelonious Monk. 1960.
I spent a lot of time with Lodius, and look, if you interviewed him on that, fine. But when conversation, it never came up.
I had a very interesting conversation with him about my poem Hell.
Yeah. Oh, that I could understand.
I gave it to him, and I said, and then a week later, I went to the 5 Spot and said, "What do you think?" He said, "Makes sense."
We're going to take a look at some of the things that are at these are slides.
The same year, I also delivered some psilocybin to him from Leary, and also to Dizzy Gillespie.
Yeah, that made
That's
sense.
1960 within our bounds.
Well,
intersecting circles.
For artists and the work of artists to be incorporated as part of a sensibility does not necessarily mean that the people who are the artists, they have to be considered proponents of a culture.
Conscious of.
I mean, their work can be adopted without their own consciousness.
And the term beat culture is something that we are talking about now, historically, about a period. It's not necessarily.
Well, was there at that time a sense of we are part of a new culture, we're part of a beat culture, we are sort of on the threshold of something that's different, or was it just happening and people knew it? And
from 45 on, it wasn't. No, Burroughs or Kerouac, myself, didn't think of it as beat.
And that thought of it as what?
New vision.
New vision.
Taking it from William Butler Yeats's book, A Vision, and taking it from Rimbaud's, When Shall We Be the First to See Christmas on Earth? A little beautiful phrase in The Season in Hell by Rimbaud, who was the first punk in a way, and also one of the earlier hashish smokers, and also one of the young kids. He wrote his best work between, 15 and 17.
By the time he's
there also were bars around New York and San Francisco and probably other cities when you were aware, I was aware of being part of a new vision culture, whatever, like the Cedar Tavern.
There was a spirit in the
San Remo.
the San Remo.
A spirit off the street, so to speak, that was in the air.
But that's also a continuation of the ancient Bohemian tradition, the artistic Bohemia.
It's Bohemia. Before there was beat, there was Bohemia. And it seems like every decade goes along. I'm the same person walking along, and every decade there's these new catcalls. A beatnik and hippie and punk and freak, and I'm the same person walking on.
Still slacker.
That's right. Isn't that true, Alan? I mean, and things were just called the works. Really, there wasn't this specialization and narrowing down.
Thanks to the Whitney, we're talking about it, and thanks to Stephen's book. But
maybe thanks to the nuclear bomb too, that there was a sudden sort of moment in history.
Kind of a nuclear fatalism.
Well, no, when people realized there was a danger to the Earth, if mankind,
terrible shock,
and womankind went on with this destructive consumption of themselves and this sense of aggression and anger that goes along with that.
There too, John Hersey's total issue of the New Yorker on the result of the bomb in Hiroshima That, I think, was also part of the epiphany of the times. How can this be? What do we do now?
Well, what was its sexuality? Let me come back to that, Alan, and ask Stephen, the sexuality that infused this.
Well, there's...
Other than just liberation.
Well, first of all, there was very, very close male bonding. That some of it was homosexual, some of it was bisexual, some of it was just friendly. But there was an enormous exploration of different kinds of sexuality that I think really fueled the group in many ways and was very important in terms of the spiritual liberation that Alan was talking about.
And reflected in your work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I began writing about it more or less directly, and that's what got my work censored when I began saying what I experienced.
I got to get to these slides. Let me take a look at the first one, which is, George, you'll recognize this, the librarian.
Yes.
You can see it over there. Tell me about it.
The librarian, in 1960, I would start my days going to a dump in a little town and gathering things to make sculptures out of, and one day all these books appeared. And it's actually a portrait of the librarian in the little town. And the question of whether this is anti-intellectual, Alan, comes up. And I think it's an affirmation that the spirit goes on. The material goods are going to all fade. But
Next slide.
Oh, Kerouac's Buddha.
Yes.
Yeah.
Tell me about it now.
Well, I've just only seen it recently in the last couple of years. I didn't know he did that. But it's got a kind of dazzling effect, actually. And he's got himself sitting there in the lower right.
Yeah.
I guess it's him.
Yeah.
But it's pretty dazzling, the funny little halo.
I apologize for having to run through these, but time forces me to.
There's a lotus at the bottom, but it's an interesting one.
This is the rose by...
This is J. DeFeo's Rose, which is an absolutely beautiful resurrection of a piece that she worked on for 7 years. And when I finally saw this in the Whitney show, I wept at seeing it.
You did.
It was just, it's a very moving, a piece that a lot of art has grown out of, even though this was done, what, in the late 50s?
Well, I think I saw it in 1959.
Yeah. The experience of seeing that in the Whitney and the sheer physicality and magnitude of it is, for my mind, it's the most moving work in the show, I think. This is, yeah.
Okay. Next slide again, Jay. Dr. Jazz.
Dr. Jazz, yeah, very large. This is showing the abstract expressionist ground that a lot of beat art came out of, and the use of real objects, which was something, how to have a place that could have both realism and abstraction.
Is that yours?
That's J. DeFeo's painting. See, to me, she was like the de Kooning of the West Coast, with this beautiful, gestural, huge, strong, bold.
I'm intrigued by the title.
Dr. Jazz.
Yeah. Well, that's part of her,
mythos.
I think jazz was the music that lived through it all. This is a Wallace Berman, and he, to me, is the quintessential beat artist.
Papa's got a brand new bag.
Yeah, that's off of a James Brown tune, and this introduces some of his way of working with an early copy machine called a Verifax, which appear in this. And he's his magazine was called Semina, and he's definitely, to me, he should have edited the entire universe, as far as I'm concerned.
Next slide. My God, there he is.
Bob
Portrait of Alan, Bob Thompson.
Yeah, I went over to the studio one day with a pink shirt, and just to visit. He was an African-American, but really friendly. Oh, I knew him pretty well. And he had a whole circle of painter friends, and like the photographer Robert Frank knew him. And I just dropped in the studio, and he said, well, why don't you sit down there? So I put myself in lotus posture, and bam, he did it in maybe an hour.
Next one is Anger of Madame News, BBQ.
Right.
Barbecue.
That's Wally Hendricks.
Wally Hendrick, yeah.
I didn't know he was so political.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, is that he actually destroyed all his paintings during the Vietnam War. Everything that led up to it, just
At one time?
as a protest. Yeah, as a protest.
Why? I mean, what was the rationale for the protest?
Well, that, everything was going to hell in a handbasket, And,
That would be 63, 64.
Yeah.
63.
Last slide, Couch.
Yeah, this is
Bruce Connors.
Bruce Connors, and this has that horror of the Holocaust of the atomic bomb that is upon. Yes, yeah. And the couch has this kind of horrific, maybe is a better way to describe it.
Yeah, I've read a lot of reviews about this exhibit, and there seems to be some debate about whether this is anthropology, whether this is, in fact, the best reflection of the Beat Generation, and whether it is something else.
I have some views on the literary aspect. Gary Snyder...
You're talking about the exhibit now.
Yeah. Gary Snyder is not sufficiently represented with his calligraphy, nor the Zen master Philip Whalen, our first so-called San Francisco Renaissance poet, Zen master, or abbot. Philip Lamantia, who was associated with the Surrealists as a young kid. Right. There's not enough of his work there, not enough of Peter Orlovsky's drawings, though his presence is there with the portraits of him by Robert Levine, who was a great painter, and then not enough of Levine, who was the court painter for a lot of us, for Kerouac and for Gary Snyder and others in San Francisco at the time.
I'm almost out of time. Speak to it since you were a consultant.
One thing that strikes me about the response to this show is there's been real difficulty even talking about the West Coast artists. One of the things that this show brings to New York and to the museum context is a lot of people like George Herms and Bruce Conner and Wallace Berman who haven't been seen, and yet the reviews essentially stick with the New York school painters and are they or are they not beat. I think the concept of beat culture is inherently a messy one. It's about a confluence of a lot of different things like spontaneity and spirituality and community and anti-materialism. It's a wide-ranging thing, and it certainly isn't a narrow aesthetic school in any way.
I'll tell you one very positive thing that's come out, and that's Alan's battle through the years and into the present against censorship throughout this country and for the human rights of writers all over the world.
I think
you transcended what a lot of the other beat guys just, they stayed within themselves. You didn't.
Gary Snyder is on ecology
but
and indigenous rights.
But you've gone farther and with more courage, I think.
I thank you. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, George. Thank you, Nat.
Thank you for your hospitality.
Yes,
pleasure.
Thank you very much.
We'll be right back. Stay with us.